Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 14. Rhodey and Betty. Contrary to what practically everyone thought, Tony and Rhodey had not gone to college together, nor had they started out as friends. In the first place, Rhodey was 5 years younger than Tony. Given that Tony had been in college at the age of 16, there was absolutely no way that Rhodey had been in college with him. Rhodey hadn't met the legendary, for all the wrong reasons, Stark heir until he'd been 22 years into his Air Force hitch. At that, the meeting hadn't been planned. Rhodey had no idea the man had even been on the base at the time. Not until he'd run into a ranting, wild-eyed, grease-covered maniac in a faded t-shirt and jeans with his hair sticking up every which way who had borne little to no resemblance to the polished, suit-wearing Mr. Stark. Rhodey had given said maniac a verbal dressing down, mostly for flailing around like that on an Air Force base where some idiot might just decide the mechanic, which is what Rhodey thought he was a threat and take him down one way or another. It hadn't been until Stain had caught up with Stark that Rhodey had realized just who he'd been scolding like an errant child. He had fully expected to get so many black marks on his record that he'd got drummed out of the Air Force in disgrace for that stunt, but Tony, being the contrary bastard he was, had decided he liked Rhodey for reasons that had escaped Rhodey's comprehension at the time. Since Tony had managed to drive his latest military liaison off with his antics, Rhodey got the nod. It had been all business at first. Rhodey'd had his hands full. This had been 2 years before Pepper came into the picture, so Rhodey'd been entirely on his own trying to figure out how to handle Tony. The traditional ways of interacting with Air Force contractors sure hadn't come close to working. Somewhere in that first 2 years before Pepper, they'd somehow managed to become friends. Rhodey still wasn't entirely sure how or exactly when it had happened, or how the hell he'd ended up seeing Tony as an annoying younger brother when Rhodey was younger than Tony. Rhodey was fairly sure that the day would never come when just hearing the word Afghanistan didn't have him seeing red. God, that had been... There weren't words to describe how Rhodey had felt the day it had happened. Coming under fire, scrambling to deal with it as everything was getting blown up, and when the dust finally settled after backup arrived, realizing that Tony was missing! The field medics had been forced to dope Rhodey to the gills and knock him out to keep him from storming straight into the desert, then and there, injuries be damned. Even at that, he'd gone AMA and AWOL, completely without shame the second he'd woken up. Fortunately, he hadn't been badly injured, just a bullet crease and some stone shrapnel from near misses. Doubly fortunately, the Air Force was eager to get Stark back and decided to pretend Rhodey had gone looking for Stark on their orders. Granted, they probably would have given that order, but Rhodey hadn't wanted to wait. When there was not so much as a whisper by the end of the week, everyone started giving up. Everyone except Pepper and Rhodey and a small handful of others. In a way, Rhodey could sort of understand it, because without a ransom demand or anything of the sort, and with far too much Afghani countryside to scour, the chances of Tony being alive, if they ever found him, would to outsiders seem to be nil. But outsiders didn't know Tony the way Rhodey and Pepper did, so they kept looking. Jarvis scoured every computer and server he could possibly get his metaphorical claws into, searching for some evidence of Tony's whereabouts. It had, in point of fact, been Jarvis that had found a fair-sized encampment in the mountains that had far too much Stark weaponry. Rhodey had been in the process of talking his superiors into a recon when the place had blown sky high. He'd been sent it immediately. It had taken every ounce of Rhodey's Air Force discipline to stay with Tony and not go steal some Jericho missiles and firebomb the shit out of the entire fucking area when Rhodey discovered what had been done to Tony. God, he'd been so pissed. Still was. Rhodey admitted that back in the States, he'd dropped the ball. Between dealing with his own feelings regarding Tony's kidnapping and torture and the whole arc reactor in the chest thing, Tony's epic levels of PTSD, Obadiah being weird, and the Air Force being really pushy about getting Tony back on the weapon-making bandwagon, he was inclined to forgive himself for putting his foot in his mouth. At any rate, he'd gotten his head out of his butt in time to help Tony deal with Stain as best he could. Things had gone back to relatively normal for a while. Then Tony started getting erratic again. Rhodey was never going to forgive himself for that one. He should have figured it out. Oh, for crying out loud. At least been a sympathetic ear or something. Stealing the war machine, wrecking Tony's house, and giving the suit to the Air Force had been the crap move to end all crap moves. And he still couldn't quite figure out why he'd done it. He'd been utterly horrified when he realized that Tony had been dying that whole time and facing it completely alone. After Vanko had been dealt with, Rhodey had looked the Air Force dead in the eye and told them to fuck off before handing the suit back to Tony, along with as much of an apology as he knew Tony would accept. 3 days later, Tony handed him the suit back, this time with Stark Industries weapons and Jarvis to help him, which had been good, because the 2 brief flights he'd had under his own power with the non-AI computer system in the suit had been interesting, and not in a good way. It had been another month of constant work with the suit before he was able to keep pace with Tony without Jarvis taking over to keep him from bashing into things or falling out of the sky. Rhodey was more than a fair pilot, but flying the suit was nothing like flying a plane or helicopter. With planes and helicopters, there were buttons and levers. The suit was a second skin, where the buttons and levers were your own body and movements. Rhodey's pilot training had worked against him, so he'd had to unlearn all he had learned. And now, all hell was breaking loose. And Rhodey meant that more or less literally, the military as a whole was having kittens and conniption fits in equal measure. They changed their minds a dozen times as to whether he was to be deployed or not since the attack, just for starters. Since the fight seemed to be over, Rhodey had opted to just take the suit out for a spin. If they eventually decided to send him to NYC, he'd be up and ready to go. If not, well, he needed to keep up his flight hours of the suit anyway. Of course, that was when Jarvis piped up. "Colonel Rhodes, sir wishes me to ask you for a favor." "Name it, and it says, Jarvis," Rhodey told the AI instantly. "He wishes for you to go to Cheyenne Mountain and escort Dr. Ross from the premises to Stark Tower." "Dr. Ross? Any relation to General Ross?" "His daughter, in point of fact," Jarvis told him. "And Tony wants her at the tower." "Dr. Ross is a brilliant scientist in fields the members of the Avengers Initiative would benefit from. Further, she is the paramour of one of the Avengers, Dr. Banner." And now Rhodey was putting the pieces together, because you couldn't have served in the military the last few years without hearing certain rumors. Not to mention the fact that Tony had grown for days after the Harlem incident. "Why do I think there's more to this than meets the eye, Jarvis?" "Because you are correct," Jarvis said. He then informed Rhodey of the full situation. By the time he'd finished, Rhodey was scowling. "That is just not right at all. I mean, yeah, Banner can evidently do some serious damage when he gets pissed off, but that doesn't make him property. Not of anyone, never mind the military. He's still a person. Yeah, I'm definitely in. I can be there in an hour. I probably won't extract her till morning, though. I can waltz in there easy enough right now, but if I leave right away, and with her, someone is bound to notice. Easier to sneak her out during a change of the guard." It was times like this that Rhodey blessed his long association with Tony. He had a security clearance much, much higher than his rank would normally warrant. That had mostly been a result of being Tony's liaison and the fact that Tony talked a lot about anything and everything with little regards for NDAs when he was in his lab and on a science cake. So Rhodey had to have clearance to know about the stuff Tony blathered out. Rhodey had also learned how to bullshit at the knee of a master. He was going to need both skills to get Dr. Ross out of the mountain without the Air Force chasing after them. Rhodey was just thrilled that the War Machine armor could open enough for him to get out of it without needing an assembly-disassembly station, because Cheyenne Mountain didn't have one. Tony had worked that feature out, rightly assuming that Rhodey would have to get in and out of the armor in a whole lot of places, only a few of which could be outfitted with a station to help him. Rhodey landed in front of the guard station, making no attempt to hide his arrival. Very shortly after that, he was escorted in, able to leave the suit, locked down by Jarvis, tucked against the wall until he was ready to get out of here with Dr. Ross. Fortunately, he wouldn't have to go far carrying her, just to the nearest airport. Jarvis had a plane already standing by, ready to take off the moment they arrived. Rhodey sort of got swept up in meetings with various brass for a bit, but this ended up being a good thing, because it allowed him to confirm that the general was not in residence at the moment. Probably, Rosie thought acidly. He was already en route to the city with one of his goon squads to attempt to collect Banner. Rhodey smirked mentally, wishing Ross luck. He was going to need it. Even if he by some miracle managed to run the Pepper Potts gauntlet, he would still have to contend with Tony, and that was one battle the general wasn't going to win. He managed to wrangle a tour of the science labs under the excuse of putting together an investigatory team to poke and prod at the Chitauri tech. That allowed him to get eyes on Betty, who looked a bit on the thin side and grimly unhappy. Rhodey didn't blame her. Being held hostage by your own father had to be a bitch. He even managed to slip her a note before he left her lab. Betty wasn't sure it was possible to hate a person more than she hated her father. He refused to let her have any freedom at all since the Harlem incident. He'd locked her away in Janine Mountain, complete with what amounted to a cell, though he claimed it to be living quarters with a convenient travel time to her lab. Escape had proved impossible. She was constantly watched, and the one time she'd managed to get to the surface, she'd been escorted back down to her quarters by MPs. Worse, the general was doing everything in his power to keep her ignorant of events in the wider world, probably hoping to keep her from finding out if Bruce was still alive and free. That didn't work quite as well as the general had hoped, because people talked, so Betty picked up bits and pieces and was able to put the rest together on her own. Today, though, she hadn't had to resort to sneaky eavesdropping, because the entire base was like a kicked-over hornet's nest. People were rushing everywhere, yelling about aliens and portals and monsters. It still hadn't calmed down even after the evening meal. Shortly after that, they had a visitor, none other than War Machine, who proved to be a clean-cut, of course, genial man with a distinctly mischievous gleam in his eye. Because Betty had been paying attention to him, she spotted the fact that there was an additional bit of paper on her workbench when he left. She swept it and several other papers up once he was gone, and careful to keep her actions concealed from the cameras she knew of in the room, peeked at the note. Banner well and safe with Stark. Meet me in cafeteria for breakfast. Betty blinked, barely daring to believe. If the note meant what she thought it did, ruthlessly she squashed the burgeoning hope. She would not do that to herself. She would not. Nope. Still hoping. Damn. This had better be what she thought it was. Somehow she managed to get through the rest of the night. She even managed to keep to her normal routine, knowing that any deviation might attract attention. The next morning she headed to the cafeteria and grabbed her usual breakfast. About 5 minutes later, Colonel Rhodes sat down across from her with his own tray and began talking to her. Betty quickly figured out what he was up to. He was talking about the gamma emissions the portal had given off and wanting to calibrate his suit's sensors to pick that sort of thing up, which meant he would need someone who knew something about gamma radiation working on the suit, which was up on the surface. Tony will probably be pissed with me, but he doesn't know gamma from a hole in the ground, so I need someone who knows what they're talking about to do this, Rhodes told her. She offered to do the calibration, and somehow Rhodes managed to sweet-talk the suit's in charge for the day into letting her. How he managed that one, she didn't know, but she was grateful for it. Once on the surface and near the suit, Rhodes whispered to her in an undertone, "Do the calibrating. I'll have to get in the suit to run the scans and make sure it works. When I do that, get behind me and grab hold of the gun mounts." Betty didn't risk responding verbally. She just did as she was told. Half an hour later, she was done, and her hands started to shake a bit as she moved, as casually as she could, around behind the suit as Rhodes stepped into it. Once the various panels had stopped moving, she lunged forward and got a death grip on the gun mounts on the suit's shoulders. 3 seconds after that, Rhodes took off like his tail was on fire, blasting out of the mountain at stunning speeds. Betty missed most of the ride as she had to bury her head and close her eyes tight to deal with the force of air rushing over her. They landed entirely too quickly to have gotten to New York City, though. Sure enough, when she lifted her head, they were in an airport. "Let go. Quicker you do, quicker we can lift off. Can't fly you there with the suit. You'll never be able to hold on that long," Rhodes told her. She prized her fingers off the gun mounts and bolted towards the plane a few feet away. Rhodes followed behind her, lifting off briefly to fly to the landing in front of the plane door, rather than try to climb stairs that probably hadn't been built to take something as heavy as the war machine had to be. Moments later, they were in the plane, and it was already taxiing to take off. Rhodes peeled the armor off while Betty collapsed into the nearest seat. "He's truly all right?" she demanded, "and not a hostage?" That made Rhodes laugh. "He's fine, and there's no way he's a hostage with Tony. Tony ripped General Ross a new one and crowed for days over the Harlem snafu. Not a chance he'd be party to keep Banner prisoner." "You know him well enough to say that?" Betty asked. Rhodes nodded. "We worked together for 15 years and been friends for 13 or 14. Tony is a lot different than what you see in the news rags. He's a stand-up guy, and the General will play hell getting within 20 miles of Bruce with Tony on his side." Betty breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you for that, Colonel." "Call me Rhodey. Pretty much everyone in Tony's circle does, and you are definitely going to be in his circle," Rhodey told her. That made Betty smile. "Rhodey, then."